Today's Vectoral Podcast is sponsored by Siva Animal Health. We all strive to do our best to encourage clients to protect their pets from parasites year-round. There's a new way to drive that conversation with clients, using pet lifestyle to educate. Where a pet lives, who it is around, and what it does every day are all factors in their level of risk of exposure to parasites. Visit Siva's new tool, www.petpestquiz.com, to learn more. Hi, Vet Girl here today, and really excited to speak with Dr. Lindsay Starkey, who you guys have heard before. She is an amazing parasitologist, and she is an associate professor at Oklahoma State University. Lindsay, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me again. I love working with you. It's awesome.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We always love having you on because I feel like I learned a lot from Dr. Dwight Bowman. Shout out to him at Cornell. But parasitology, man, it just feels like 30 years ago because it was 30 years ago. And I know so much has changed. But before we begin, do you mind just giving us a little bit of background about who you are, where you trained, and what you do now, just so our Vet Girl audience knows a little bit more about you?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as you said, I'm back at Oklahoma State after a hiatus away at Auburn. So, I did all of my veterinary and residency training at Oklahoma State, focused on ticks and tick-borne infections. And then I got to do a lot of heartworm stuff when I was down at Auburn, which I absolutely loved doing. But I got the chance to move back closer to family and get some additional involvement in the National Center of Veterinary Parasitology, which is housed at Oklahoma State. So, made the move back last year, and now I'm teaching second year students 4 out of 5 days of the week in the fall semester. But it's a really fun time to be back here where I did a lot of my training and to have kind of some new roles in parasitology.
Well, I absolutely love it. And for all the veterinary students who are listening, this is so important to pay attention to. Man, if I could do vet school all over again, there's definitely some areas I would have paid a lot more attention to. Now, I wanted to talk to you about parasite protection by pet lifestyle. Obviously, people around the world listen to this podcast. It's been downloaded in over 160 countries. So we're going to see parasites that vary all over the world, all over by season. Now, in full disclosure, I'm based out of Minnesota, but even we name the state bird the mosquito because we have 10,000 lakes, right? So it's going to really vary based on where you live. And I wanted to talk to you about a new way to talk with clients about the importance of year-round parasite protection. And I will say, even in Minnesota, it's 30 degrees out right now. And once in a while, I'll still find that darn mosquito inside the house, right? And my cat's completely indoors. Now, I did want to talk to you and start by first talking about CAPC. First of all, what is CAPC? And why are the CAPC maps an important part of client conversations when you're talking to your pet owners about year-round parasite prevention?
Absolutely. So CAPC is one of my favorite tools to use. So it stands for the Companion Animal Parasite Council. And shout out to Dwight Bowman. He was integral in some of the earlier days of CAPC for sure. So there are, since this is global, right? So if you're over in Europe, there's SCAP over there, and they make some great parasite recommendations and have tools for practitioners in Europe. There's TROCAP for our more tropical countries, Latin American countries. So you may have your own regional variant, essentially, of CAPC, but CAPC is Canada and the United States, and they have some great maps based on big data that's acquired through our major reference laboratories. And so if you're having your animals tested in your hospital and that data is accessible by IDEXX, Antech, Zoetis, right? Like if we send that data in, that can get integrated into these giant CAPC maps, which I think help us have that more pointed local conversation where our hospital is and where most of our clients are hopefully residing for majority of the year, but also to have a little proactive of a conversation, which I think is what we're going to talk about a little bit in this podcast too, because travel plays a huge role in that lifestyle and that risk.
Thank you so much. A lot of people sometimes don't have time to talk to pet owners about travel, right? We in Minnesota, we oftentimes will have people who are retired who winter in Arizona and they come back in Minnesota during the summer. I used to work in Alaska during a summer, and people will come up and travel and their pets aren't protected at all, spreading infectious disease and parasites throughout states that don't normally have it. So it is important to ask that question. Now, why is it important to ask questions about pet lifestyle? Obviously, we just talked about travel, but specifically where the pet lives, who it is around, and what the day-to-day activities are when talking with clients about protecting their pets from vector-borne illnesses and diseases.
Yeah, so their lifestyle largely dictates what they might be exposed to. So, are they hanging out with buddies that might also share some parasites with them that may not be as well cared for? And so, whether that's at a dog park or doggy daycare, which I think doggy daycares are getting really good about some routine screenings before animals can come. But at the same time, who's doing that screening is not necessarily regulated. And I've seen some international travel certificates that I'm like, there's no way that this animal was dewormed with this flea drug. Sorry. Like, you can write whatever you want on those things. So it's really important that we have to have that conversation. Unfortunately, I'm sorry I'm making more work for y'all in the exam room or for your team, but there is still no perfect parasite preventive program that I can just say, hey, if we're all just going to do this, then we're good and we're covered because there's parasites that aren't covered by all the preventives that we have out there. Certain pets are going to have different risks. We need to do more screening on some pets based on their lifestyle because they are far more likely to maybe have parasites compared to a counterpart. And then I just want to circle back to the travel thing because if I didn't hit it hard enough, like you said, if you travel to Arizona in the winter, I hope you're still active on your flea control because plague is a huge problem in that part of the country. And if you go down there and take your animals out and go hiking, like that's an additional risk they have there that they don't have in Minnesota. Like you just don't have endemic plague in Minnesota, but you absolutely do in the Four Corners. Same thing if you snowbird in the Southeast. That's heartworm central, and that is a huge snowbird location. And so they need to be active on their heartworm preventive, at least at a minimum, probably flea control too, right? Because the South and fleas because we don't want these breakages to happen in our parasite protection programs because then we're going to have introduction of something. And maybe it's just something like flea tapeworm, which isn't the biggest deal medically, but is a huge deal from a human animal bond perspective. Or maybe we have plague or heartworm, and those are huge medical deals for the pet and maybe even the human counterparts too. So asking those travel plans or getting that good travel history so that we can maybe predict travel plans in the future for this family, hugely important. Talking about what this animal eats, where they go day to day. Are they completely indoors? Are they partially outdoors? That is all very important in evaluating, okay, what is the ultimate level of risk that this pet has today and in the months to come? What sort of screening do I need to do? And what does this comprehensive integrated parasite protection program really look like? And it's not just a simple, yep, do this and you're fine. Like, I wish we were there. We're not there.
Such important information. I oftentimes will have a lot of friends and colleagues who are like, hey, what should I do, for my dog and cat? And, we all hate getting those questions. But my simple answers to them is always do what your vet does for their own pets. And as veterinary professionals, both our cats and dogs should be on year-round preventive medicine, not only to prevent disease, but to also make sure that we're not spreading it. And again, this is so, so important. We have to make sure our staff are educated. We have to make sure we're all aligned. So we're delivering that same message to our pet owners. And again, so, so important. Now, I know we're talking about location. I think this is really important. Years ago, I had a colleague who was, well, actually, she was from high school. I haven't talked to her in 40 years. And she pinged me on Facebook saying that her 17-year-old cat, who lives in a high rise in New York City, came down with pan luke. And it was because the cat was 17 years old, it was indoors, and it hadn't been to a vet in over a decade. And she was fostering kittens, right? And it's so important that we, again, always ask these important questions. That's what I want to talk to you about. What do we do, or how might a recommendation differ when recommending a parasite prevention routine when a client whose cat is always indoors and lives on the 17th floor of a New York City high rise versus a client with a neighborhood roaming cat that lives in the suburbs of Orlando? Is our talk going to differ?
Yeah. And again, that just makes it harder for us, right? We have to be more versed in what that real risk and variety looks like. So, for your friend with her New York City kitty, right? So, before she started fostering kittens, I'm going to assume that's a recent-ish thing, right? Her cat probably was pretty well protected because there's not a lot of points of introduction. That being said, I don't think rodents necessarily respect our boundaries. And I think there's a lot of buildings that might have a rodent or an insect problem here or there. And those make great parotenic hosts for giving intestinal parasites or even some more systemic parasites to a cat that might get the opportunity to eat said rodent or insect, which I think is most cats, especially if they're bored and inside all the time. But A lot of folks have a patio or a catio that they might let their animal out on or open the windows, and mosquitoes can definitely fly that high. Fleas do not respect your walls and your boundaries. So if your neighbor has an animal that doesn't have active flea control on board, those flea stages could be deposited in and around your boundaries and cross over and get on your animal. So even though we think, okay, high rise, indoor only, super low risk, it's not, even when they're an individual. And then when you start introducing kittens that aren't necessarily vaccinated or dewormed or anything like that, they're bringing stuff in, whether that's trichomoniasis diarrhea, whether that's coccidia, roundworm stages into a shared litter box that are now going to be a problem. So New York City high-rise kitty, maybe lower risk depending, but still some risk. Orlando cat, parasite ridden. Like you need to be doing fecals on that cat monthly because I guarantee you they have spirometra tapeworms, they have lungworms, they have all sorts of fun things from my perspective as a parasitologist but not fun things as a former cat owner. And if I were the client in charge of that cat, because I don't want to see that cat vomit up a giant tapeworm, which is exactly what they can do when they have spirometra. And none of our routine preventives can control that. The only way to control that is to keep the cat from eating the periaquatic vertebrate that it chose to consume. And so there are a lot of parasites beyond our preventive program from a control standpoint. Giardia. None of our preventives touch that one either. And that's rampant in some locations, depending on where you go. So we do have to have those conversations and then choose our drug regimen appropriately, choose our lifestyle recommendations. Like if we cannot do these things, that would be great from the parasite perspective for your pet. But also just screening. I know I need to screen that Orlando animal more frequently and maybe with a different strategy of testing than might be my routine for some of my other pets who maybe are more indoor only or lead lower risk lifestyles.
Great, great information. Having adopted or rescued a parvo dog who also had beaver fever, what we call it in Minnesota, because we have so many lakes with Giardia, we oftentimes forget about the importance of reiterating to the pet owner, you have to treat about the zoonotic risk. All the kids have to wash their hands. You have to make sure you're picking up all the poop because we worry about chronic Giardia and no swimming in lakes, for X amount of time because we always worry about that. And, it's hard because in real life, in clinical practice, we oftentimes don't have that extra 10 minutes to talk to the pet owner about it, right? And I always say, don't reinvent the wheel. Sometimes it's just printing out a great handout that's been vetted, get it, already can really help. All right, now I wanted to ask you another question. How might a recommendation differ when recommending a parasite prevention routine with a client whose dog rarely leaves a patio of a townhome in San Francisco versus a dog like mine that goes hiking with its owner or goes to doggy daycare in Boston?
You throw out all the things. So again, it's just in that moment, in that exam room, having one of your team members start getting these initial questions answered, right? So that in the interim between them coming out and you going in, you've already had time to kind of evaluate where we are on this risk level, bring in a great handout. And now there is a really good one that does exist where you can kind of go through this triage of lifestyle selections and try to say, okay, what are some of my higher risk issues associated with this pet's lifestyle, or is it one of the lower risk lifestyles? There is no risk lifestyle. And some people would probably think townhome, San Francisco doesn't really go outside, probably no risk lifestyle. Well, Northern California has heartworm. If you're in California, Northern California is where you don't want to be from a heartworm perspective. But plenty of tick-borne diseases, flea-associated thing, intestinal parasites are everywhere, right? So we can't avoid all of those things. And so even though that animal truly is pretty home restricted, there are still some things that can find their way into that animal's home environment that the client may not even be aware of, right? The parotenic host conversation with internal parasites is a huge thing that we overlook. And then, just fleas, ticks, and mosquitoes. We can try to keep them away, but sometimes we have to do extra things in our strategy to do that. It would probably be easier for that dog, but the hiking dog, oh my gosh, you need to employ every method you can to try to protect them, particularly against ectoparasites, because you are entering a known danger zone when it comes to things like ticks. And that's something that I have very little tolerance for. And that being said, my own dog has tested positive for a tick-borne pathogen in the past. He was never clinical. He was on the best tick control program at the time. This was several years ago when I was a resident, But at the same time, he tested positive. A tick got on him for long enough to transmit bacteria into his system that he generated an antibody response to, and he maintained that antibody response for years. And so I never treated him. I always checked him to make sure his blood was good, right? PCR was always negative. He had no active infection, but he did have an infection at one point in time that caused what turned out to be a chronic diagnostic plan that I had to pursue on an annual basis. And so depending on what they do and where they live geographically, but also urban, rural, in the home, out of the home, on the patio. Like all of that really does matter and trying to figure out where they are on that spectrum, right? And that's what it is. There's the spectrum of risk, and every animal has some. Some animals have way more, and our strategies should be different for those animals that have way more.
All right, awesome information. Now, are there benefits of having a variety of options to choose from when recommending products? Obviously, we have limited shelf space. Sometimes there's confusion even among veterinary teams on what to use. And I think we do have to be educating our staff, so we know this too. But what do we choose from when recommending products to use to protect against fleas, ticks, mosquitoes, heartworm disease, and other GI worms? And if so, what are the benefits of having a variety to choose from and why?
Variety is a double-edged sword, right? So the question I get all the time is, what's the one thing I can do? And I unfortunately can't give you that answer because medically it's not an appropriate answer to give. Like I can tell you what I do. And you mentioned that earlier, right? Like having that conversation with your vet about what they're doing for their pets is a great starting point. But at the same time, your dogs may have different risks than my dogs, right? And I've got super young kids that don't know not to put their fingers in their mouths after they've touched the dog. And one of my dogs is she eats her own poop, which is super frustrating for me, right? So like her being parasite free is crucial to my family's health because I have a 7-month-old and a 4.5-year-old that we're struggling daily with that whole stay away from the dog's mouth, don't let them lick you, wash your hands conversation, right? And so the variety is great because we do really need that variety to make sure we're fitting client preferences on duration of product, route of application of product, but that we're also fitting the medical needs that we are picking based on that patient's risk, where they fall on that spectrum. Do they need super broad spectrum deworming and do they need it frequently? Or could we get away with probably less deworming and do some monitoring and testing? Do we need like super duper tick control and repellency on board for this pet because they're so high risk for all those things? Or are we a little lower on the risk spectrum and we're really focused on flea control and we use lifestyle and environmental approaches to help reduce tick or mosquito risk, right? So having the variety is great, but it does make it tougher for us and our whole team to know what's going on. And I just did a new project, essentially, if you will, with my students here at OSU, where I split them into teams. They did not get to pick their teams. So they're acting like a hypothetical hospital with 4 colleagues that they may or may not necessarily get along with. And they had to pick which 4 heartworm preventives they would stock on their shelves. They were only allowed 4. And whatever else they did was part of the conversation. And whatever else that company may provide them from choosing certain products, right? Like that was part of it too. It wasn't just parasites that we were talking about, it was kind of the whole business of this as well. And they defended their choices a couple of weeks ago to myself and the other instructors in the course. And it was really interesting to see what selections were made. And then when we prodded them on certain questions, like, why this over this, right? Or did you consider this over this? And so they had to really think through that. Okay, we need some variety, but we have to limit our variety too. We can't, as veterinarians, literally stock everything that exists out there for the one-off client that may come in and demand that. Or we feel like, okay, there may be this one client on the planet that may walk into my practice one day that this would be the perfect product for. Like, that's not a reason for us to stock it on our shelves. Online pharmacy, absolutely. Like, we can send it to them from our clinic directly. That's great. But we need to know and have that conversation about, all right, are you struggling with compliance or is this something you can do on a monthly or every other month basis, depending on the product? Are you gonna let your dog swim and bathe and are they outside all the time? All right, we're gonna need these additional strategies to make sure this animal's protected. Do you hike, right? We're gonna need these additional strategies to make sure we're protected. So we have to tailor our product selection or products selection because sometimes for some of these pets, it's more than one that we really need to be recommending. Um, and it just makes it harder for us and our team. But again, aligning the whole team, having the whole team participate in this conversation from entering the hospital to leaving the hospital. If there's not alignment with the team, the client's not going to know the message, right? And so it does take some training, but I think it's training well worth doing for the whole clinic to make sure that we are, because that's our profession, right? We want to protect animals and we want to protect families. And parasite control and prevention is really one key way in doing that.
All right. Awesome information. Last question. What's the end game for the veterinary team to help the pet owner protect their pet against parasites?
That's a great question. So again, team effort, and we've got to ask the questions leading up, do our risk evaluation, right? And then we've got to get these integrated approaches out the door. And there will be a spectrum of things we can choose from and may choose from, right? So lower risk animal, let's focus on heartworm, right? Because that can be difficult to diagnose sometimes. It is extensive when it comes to treatment for that, and the damage never actually gets completely fixed, right? So I definitely don't want to let heartworm fall through the cracks for any of my patients, right? So I'm going to have heartworm on my list. Fleas are everywhere, right? We're just not going to avoid them regardless. So those are also going to be on my strategy for every animal. All right. And then ticks, that becomes a maybe more unique conversation when we really talk about lifestyle. Where are we going or who are we interacting with? Those really do introduce our tick risk for pets. And I'm not excluding cats on this tick conversation either. They absolutely can have tick risk in their life. And then do we do all the extra things too? And I think we should always have that conversation about the non-pet approaches to parasite prevention, right? Tell them how these infections happen, where this happened. Maybe we can avoid doing that or try to limit the pet's ability to do that. Or maybe we can treat and target the environment and get some of those stages out of there so that they are lower risk to our pet. And oftentimes that'll spill over and protect human health too. And so don't forget, we've got on animal approaches that can be topical, right? So we apply them to the outside of the animal. That's the only way we can actually introduce repellency because it just doesn't exist in an oral or injectable formulation at this point in time. And that's a chemistry problem I'm not going to solve today. And so if we need to be stopping that bite from happening, which is ultimately how the animal doesn't have discomfort associated with bites, we can thwart flea allergy dermatitis that way. We can keep ticks from even transmitting pathogens into the system, right? Like my dog, if that tick never bit my dog, he would have never tested Ehrlichia positive. That's just the truth of that situation, right? But the tick bit and it was attached long enough, right, that a few Ehrlichia organisms got into his system and his immune system responded. So we've got on animal approaches that can target repellency, but they have to be applied topically. And sometimes that's not combined with some other feature that we really do want, say intestinal parasite control or really robust heartworm prevention, say. And so we might have to combine that with an oral or an injectable strategy. But just remember, if your oral strategy for vectors is what you're using, that vector has to bite the animal to get the compound to then die. And that does leave us a little window of time, right? And we're trying to evaluate with different studies how big of a deal is that speed of kill in that window of time. And a lot of our products are really good at preventing the passing of whatever pathogen it is we're concerned about, but still the bite happened and the discomfort happened and the flea allergy can happen, right? So combining all these things and then talking about that environment and talking about seasonality, geography, travel, right? And I actually use a multimodal approach on my dogs, and we treat our yard because we've got deer and raccoons running around our yard. And God, I wish I could get the raccoons to stop coming up on my porch, quite frankly. We're not trying to get them to do it. Some people do, right? Like some people bait raccoons and feed them, and I'm just like, no, bad idea all around. Stop doing that, right? But we treat our yard, and my dogs do have a very restricted lifestyle. They don't go to dog parks, they don't go to doggy daycare, they're at my house all the time, and they don't leave my yard, really, unless we go for a walk on the neighborhood on a leash and stay on the pavement, right? So I'm reducing their parasite potential. Again, circling this back to one of my big objectives, keeping my kids parasite free and safe, because I cannot control what the 4.5-year-old puts in his mouth until like sometimes it's just too late. And I was like, what did you just do? Right. And if that involved a parasite stage that could be potentially infectious to him, again, I need my animals as parasite free as possible. And trying to do that takes this kind of integrated global approach. So that's the end game, right? Is maybe they can get away with one or two things, but sometimes for some of these animals, you're going to have to throw the whole, here's the things we should be doing. Please do as many of these as you can, right? And that's the other part of it is what can they buy into and afford to take with them out of the clinic or agree to do compliantly once they leave your hospital. And hopefully, with the right team approach, conversations at every single point during that appointment and visit, we can really get that message across to how important this really is. It's protecting their pet, it's protecting them, it's protecting their family, it's protecting other pets too, by having these animals having fewer risks and fewer parasites.
You know what, Dr. Starkey, we could do a whole different podcast on dog parks, but that's a whole nother story, right? We
Yeah.
have a dog park that's about 2 miles away from the vet clinic I used to be at. And man, the things that we see, right? So accident prone. I see people walking around barefoot at the dog park. I'm just like,
Oh.
oh, yeah. It's so important that we really, really stay passionate about the importance of pet owner education, right? That person walking barefoot has no idea about the dangers of zoonotic disease in a disgusting dog park, right? Where
And a
pets may
place
not be
where
on preventative.
and they intentionally go to defecate. Like if you're in an
Exactly.
urban place, that is where they take them to potty. Like
Exactly.
in my town, I would take my dog there to like socialize and get him outside and get me outside. Back in the day, I don't take my dogs now because we have a big yard. But when I was a poor student, I didn't have a big yard. So we would go to the
Exactly.
dog park, but he got routine fecals too.
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome, awesome information. Always sincerely love chatting with you. I learned so much. Really appreciate your time today. And thanks for all that you do.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. Take care.